Hi, welcome to Plato's Cave, your speakeasy for ideas, where Tom and Dave show us how to think like the American founders. Grab a drink if you'd like. The conversation about saving our republic is about to begin.
Tom, a lot to get into today. I hope we can get this in within the time allotted and that we normally stick to. And if we don't, I think for the sake of this conversation, it deserves whatever time we need to give it. That said, before we go there, we did post a new case study this week. It is the start of the month.
Yeah.
I think it's a fun one. This one is a little bit different than what we've done in the past.
Yes.
We are challenging our members to think about what should be in a good or a quality commencement speech.
Yeah.
Now that we're getting into graduation season,
it's a little lighter. It's a little more fun. Although, it's commencement, it's graduation. It raises all these great big subjects like what should education be and what should someone graduating from high school, college, whatever it is. What should they have learned? What should they be expecting when they go out in the world? So, you can go as deep as you want to go, but it's a little, there's some levity to this case study.
And I'm going to actually, because there is some big topics happening in the world that we have to talk about.
Yeah.
We're going to get to the case study later in the month.
Yep.
We will get to this at some point, and we will share what we think should be in a commencement speech, although you did some of that in the case study, although I'd love to dig into those a little bit further. What I would love is some of our members, whether it's in one of the forums, probably be the best place. Let's start a conversation in there. Let's start that conversation in the forums, on the website, on the app. And I'd love to hear what some people think, so that if we do add this in, I'd love to reference some of those things in a future podcast.
In fact, I'm going to go one step farther. I'm going to throw out a kind of challenge to our members. If someone has an idea for what a good commencement address should be and wants to write it up, do that and put it in the forums and let's show it off a little bit. Let other people respond to it and get some constructive criticism and some opinions. Show us what you think a good commencement address should be.
You did mention something in the case study document about brevity.
Yeah,
that it doesn't have to be long just because it's a commencement speech.
Yeah.
I've sat through some really long ones and I've sat through some really short ones.
Yes.
Also, one more challenge for anybody who we encouraged people in the case study to go look for good ones that they found online.
Yeah.
There was one I spent a little bit of time looking for, and I did not dig as much as I'd like to. And I can't believe I can't even remember his name, but there was an anthropology professor at CU Boulder who actually really taught a good class and gave some really good life lessons as a student.
Yeah.
I had my first semester, my sophomore year.
Yeah.
And he provided some really good lessons to be successful in college. But at the end of the class, he delivered what he had given 3 times previously as the commencement speaker at graduation.
Okay.
This was just a professor at CU. He wasn't Clarence Thomas. He wasn't this really famous name,
right.
But he was one of the more liked professors on campus.
Yeah.
And he did his commencement speech on the story of the sockeyed salmon, the life of the sockeyed salmon who swims upstream. The whole thing was based around that theme. And there has to be a video out there somewhere. If anybody could find it. I think about how my theoretical, philosophical, and life views have changed between my first semester of my sophomore year of college and today.
Yeah.
I would love to go back and watch it and think, was that really as good as I thought it was then? Or was he more on the progressive end of the spectrum and I just didn't realize it at the time? So if anybody can stumble across that, we have a few members who are heavily involved in the University of Colorado. They might know exactly who I'm talking about.
Sure.
And maybe we can track that down too. It would be an interesting thing to watch.
When people do their searching, what they're going to find, the most famous commencement speeches tend to be from famous people, important either political figures or, celebrity types. I actually watched part of a commencement speech by J.K. Rowling, who did all the Harry Potter books. And I believe, if I remember, I think she's a Harvard alum, and she was invited back to Harvard to give the commencement address. Oh, and it was good. The part I saw, she's very witty and very clever and very funny, and right. So she was weaving in good life advice in a very clever way.
Sure.
But a great commencement address doesn't have to come from a famous person. It can come from a not famous person and just be filled with, wonderful, great advice and be entertaining all at the same time.
One more comment on this topic. I will also say we've talked about some of President Trump's better speeches and some of his not as good speeches. He gave the commencement speech probably 2019 because it was probably pre-COVID at the Air Force Academy. Down in the Springs, and we knew a lot of people who went, and I watched that video. That was one of the better speeches he ever delivered, and it was a very impressive one. So another one for people that they might want to go take a look at.
So is anything going on in the world, Dave?
A little bit here and there. I want to start actually going back to the last two podcasts we've talked about Twitter.
Yeah,
and I want to talk about a Twitter exchange that I had a couple of years ago with a former friend. And I say this as a former friend. He and I were never close, but we were in the same group of friends. And this was sort of the moment I split from that group of friends almost entirely. Okay. They are very, very progressive. They had serious problems with my opinions, the things I like to talk about with them. And there was no...
Your lack of progressivity.
Right. Is that a word? We're going to make it one.
I just made it one.
They did not want... There was no interest in conversation. Yeah. They would get together in groups and berate me.
Yeah.
And they would team up and berate me on social media. I think I talked about one of them in the past. I made a comment about democracy is two wolves and a sheep trying to decide what to have for lunch.
Yeah.
And one of them made 20 points that he wanted to use in response to that, wrote them out in Word, and then dropped them one at a time into my feed just to spam my feed so nobody else's comments could be seen. I mean, it got to the point of obnoxiousness. But I had this one conversation. I don't even remember what I originally posted. And this guy responded to me. He says, You really believe the world is turning into 1984, don't you?
Meaning Orwell's
1984.
Novel. Yes,
right.
Yes.
Which actually prompted me. I hadn't read it since high school, maybe once in college. And it prompted me to go back and reread all of those. I started rereading 1984 and Animal Farm and Brave New World and sort of refamiliarizing myself with the details. And the more I read them, the more I realized, we really are getting to 1984, and he's right. That I believe that. Now, he thought I was out of my mind for that, and he decided to say that I was silly. Now, all of a sudden, this week or last week, we learned that the Biden administration has created what I'm just going to go ahead and call the Ministry of Truth.
Right.
For those who know the 1984 reference, I believe it's called the Disinformation Governance Board.
Right.
Which is all in response to Elon Musk buying Twitter, which has been the topic for the last two podcasts. And we're not going to go back there, but this whole thing is crazy. The first thing I will say, little tangent, but the first thing I will say is I'm thinking about, okay, Ministry of Truth. There is probably nobody I know better who has studied the idea of truth than you. And I'm sitting there wondering, do we need to just break up the Vino Veritas Society and go get you as the Minister of Truth?
I have bad news, Dave. I've been hired as the new Minister of Truth. No, I don't think the folks in Washington, D.C. would want anything to do with me.
They don't like your version of the truth. Yeah. Apparently there's the truth. There's the truth, and then there's their truth and your truth and her truth and his truth. So what does a disinformation governance board do when they have to decide whose truth is correct? When they don't believe in the idea of truth, how can you have a disinformation governance board when there's no such thing as disinformation if everybody's truth is their own?
It's absolutely, that's sort of the $1 million question today. I mean, it's the pitfall that is always there. It's the shadow of relativism. Trying to get rid of this problem. Once you buy into that nihilistic, notion that there is no truth, everything you say it's like trying to jump over your own shadow. It's impossible because you dismiss truth and then you turn around and you want to claim something's true. After right?
Yeah.
establishing this premise that there is no truth. And this problem comes across in 1,000 different iterations, 1,000 different ways, including something like a government bureaucracy filled with progressives who mock the notion of, they mock it, they laugh at it. They'll say, they're sitting around their cocktail parties. I've been there with them. And then, they'll smugly say, well, who's to say what's right and wrong, or what's true and what's not? And then they get up the next morning and go to their work at the Ministry of Truth.
Well, and I think we all know the Ministry of Truth, there is something completely unconstitutional about it. Never mind that it's a bureaucratic agency, which inherently makes it unconstitutional.
Yeah.
The idea that now the government is creating an agency to control speech, and to control.
I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, or one of our listeners can correct me, I think I saw that this is within the Department of Homeland Security.
Correct.
I think.
Yes, I did see the same thing.
Which means it has, police enforcement powers.
They're justifying that by saying that this is in response to Russian disinformation that has been influencing our elections.
Right.
But
like Hunter Biden's laptop, right? That was Russian disinformation.
Yeah.
For those who don't know, I mean, this is how ridiculous. This is where we are.
Yeah.
Right. A story comes out about a laptop. There are allegations, not proven, not disproven, allegations this might be Hunter Biden's laptop, and there's some really condemning stuff in there about how he's using his dad's connection in Ukraine and other foreign governments, right, to enrich himself. And Joe Biden himself, right, comes out and says, oh, that's just Russian disinformation.
Right.
Big tech social media platforms start deleting and blocking and restricting account. Anyone who's just talking to it, hey, did you hear this story? There's this laptop. It might be they shut it all down. And it turns out it's true. The story is actually true. And so this is just a snapshot of what, the Ministry of Disinformation is going to do.
The Biden administration continues to, every time, this has been like 4 podcasts in a row now, where every time I say something, by the time we get to the next week, they said, oh, wait, he's correcting us, and we need to make this right. And the point, the example I'm using here is, I was saying last week, this is not a freedom of speech violation.
Right.
The whole idea of Musk buying Twitter and making it an open platform has nothing to do with freedom of speech. It has to do with the pursuit of truth.
Yes.
The Biden administration just made me a liar.
Yeah,
they literally just said, well, we need this to be about what we want it to be about.
That's
so they create this Ministry of Truth, this government disinformation board.
And I wasn't going to go down this path very far, but it's worth pointing out the whole premise of philosophy, the whole premise of what we call science. I mean, that word, the Latin root of science is just scientia, which means to know.
Right.
It really meant the same thing as classical philosophy, the love of knowledge, the love of wisdom. So the premise of these activities, philosophizing is an activity. Science is scientific inquiry is an activity. The premise is that truth exists, but we don't have adequate knowledge of it. We don't know all of the truth. We want to know more. And so we observe and ask questions, right? And do experiments and try to learn about the world. And that work, that activity requires real effort. So, one of the most famous clashes in American history, those famous debates between Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas, the man who would become the first Republican president of the United States, Abraham Lincoln, and the most influential incumbent Democratic politician in America at that time, Stephen Douglas. There's Douglas saying, there is no right and wrong. Right. Slavery is neither right nor wrong. We should be pro-choice about slavery. Some people choose to have slavery.
Curious word choice.
And they're good people. I have friends who have slaves and they're good. And other people in other communities and other states choose to not have slavery. And that's fine for them. We don't have to fight about these things. We shouldn't fight about these things because there is no right and wrong. That's Douglas. And then along comes Abraham Lincoln in these debates and says slavery is inherently wrong, intrinsically wrong, because it always involves the violation of the natural rights of certain the people who were enslaved. And it doesn't matter how popular slavery is. It doesn't matter if slavery is approved by, 60% of voters or 90% or 100% of voters. Those votes don't make the wrongness of slavery right. Now, there are two diametrically opposed positions.
Sure.
What would a ministry of truth have to say? What would a governance, what is it called? Disinformation governance board, right? The point is, these are deep philosophic question that requires the activity of thinking and analyzing, right? And trying to figure this stuff out. In a way, this whole notion of a disinformation governance board points to the complete progressive bureaucratization of America, that everything should be up to bureaucratic experts, including things like the truth.
Right.
Subject like truth. That is something for some unelected bureaucrat to decide what is true.
You're usually the one to put a sharper edge on things.
Yeah.
I'm going to do it this time on what you just said, because this is so important. What progressives just told us this week is that you and I and our members and every other American who's not part of this government bureaucracy are incapable of knowing truth.
Yeah.
We are incapable of deciphering information, of going through it and actually knowing what is true and what is not. And we must have government experts to tell us what is true.
And they are. We are incapable of knowing what the truth is or pursuing the truth. They are capable, which raises this just juicy, delicious, wonderful question. What is it they have that we don't have? How is it that they, in that bureaucracy, what tools or instruments or knowledge or what do they have that allows them to discover the truth that you and I are missing, Dave?
And if they do have access to things like information, should we know it? Should it be public? Do they have a right to know things about foreign governments and or about our own government or about our neighbors or about other things that they're allowed to know and we're not?
Yeah.
It's also an interesting thought process of how long will it take before you can get a master's degree in education a master's degree in truth,
right?
In understanding truth, in a master's degree in disinformation. It's just kind of this whole fascinating thing.
It also raises a gigantic question of the whole relationship between government and media and journalists. There are still some real journalists out there. I'm thinking there's just this wonderful, brilliant investigative journalist, Cheryl Atkinson. I got to meet her. She did an interview with me, and man, she is hard-nosed and gritty, and she's been around. You're not fooling her, at least not easily. And there are others like her out there doing real investigative journalism. So what happens when the Ministry of Truth puts out a decree and said, here's what is true, and some journalists say, yeah, we're not buying it.
Right.
We don't think that's actually true. Does the Ministry of Truth go arrest those journalists? Right.
Well, it's national security. It's Homeland Security. So they do have that power.
Right.
It's funny you bring up the journalist route, and we hadn't talked about going down there, but I've been comparing two video clips recently. One was Minka. We talked about this. Mika Brzezinski.
Yes.
Who's on MSNBC, Morning Joe. Her and her husband, Joe Scarborough. Is it Joe Scarborough? Is that his name?
I think so, yeah.
I say his name and I think of the movie The Longest Yard. Bo Scarborough was Burt Reynolds' character in the original Longest Yard.
Right.
So you have Joe and Mika, who she literally said, it's our job to tell people what to think. That we played that clip on last week's podcast, I believe.
Yeah.
She actually said, it is our job to tell people what to think. Conversely, a former student of yours, believe it or not, it was Monday night. I've been watching Gutfeld at night.
Okay.
On occasion.
That makes me nervous, Dave, when you reference a former student of mine, because I never know if that former student said something wise or foolish, right? So I'm always ready to cringe, thinking, "Oh no, please tell me they didn't say something foolish."
You're gonna be proud of this one.
Okay, all right. All right.
Monday night's Gutfeld was one of my all-time favorites. He had two guests on who I absolutely love. One is Mike Rowe, Dirty Jobs.
Yeah, good guy.
And then one was John Taffer.
Oh yeah.
The bar rescue guy. So you have his two like extra guests. He always has his two regulars and his two extra guests. One was John Taffer, one was Mike Rowe. It was a show that I just couldn't miss.
I want to go see that. I like both those guys. Yeah.
But one of his regulars is one of your former students, Kat Timpf.
Oh, sure. Right.
And they were talking about something else. They were talking about this Ministry of Truth thing. And she actually made the comment. She said, we're journalists. Isn't it our job to go investigate and determine the truth? So you compare the Fox. I mean, look, I'm never the full defender of Fox. Right. I know Fox has its agenda and they're doing their same things. And I take some of it with a grain of salt. And I don't watch Fox a whole lot, but I like Gutfeld. So I'm watching that and I hear her say something really proper, really correct, that it is the media's job, it is a journalist's job to go out and investigate and discover what is really happening. Whereas on MSNBC, you have Mika saying, forget investigating. It's our job to tell people what to think.
Right.
And you just think about that contrast there. So now we have the Ministry of Truth. And while I would love to me, that should be a lawsuit already.
Well, and here, just to tie this back around, you mentioned Orwell's 1984. And in that famous book, a recurring theme is the subject of truth. And it's very clear what truth is. Truth is what the party says is true right now.
Yep.
Always subject to change. If the party changes his mind and decides something else is true tomorrow, then that'll be the truth tomorrow. But the point is truth is inseparable from propaganda. Truth is whatever the party, the governing, controlling party is putting out. And that's the problem you run into with a partisan government organization that has its own agenda to be the official, right, federal arbiters of what is true and what is not. Very quickly, they start to substitute their propaganda for truth.
And the reason for that is the same theme we have been talking about for 2 years now, 101 episodes now.
Yeah.
And that is incentives matter, right? The government is sitting here every time talking about they're going to tell us what they think is true, but their incentive is to get reelected. So Joe Biden's never going to tell us that my son was giving me favors.
Now, Dave, the progressives solved this problem with the creation of an unelected bureaucratic state. See, they're not running for it. Anthony Fauci doesn't need to be reelected. Therefore, they have no incentive. They have no interest beyond our good, our safety. Now, I'm being facetious about that, sarcastic, but that actually was the justification that progressives offered 120, 30, 40 years ago for the creation of these gigantic federal bureaus of unelected bureaucrats. Their argument was, well, they won't have interests because they're not running for reelection.
I would love one person ever to introduce me to one human being on this planet that doesn't have an interest in anything, that has no incentives at all. So there is a problem with this whole Ministry of Truth. I think there's a huge legal problem. I think there's a huge constitutional problem with this government disinformation governance board.
Yeah.
And while it needs to be brought up to the Supreme Court, it brings us to our other huge topic of the week.
Yeah.
And that is a leaked preliminary draft opinion from Justice Alito talking about this Supreme Court case that is potentially going to overturn Roe v. Wade.
Right. I mean, look, this is still very fresh news. As of this recording of this podcast, there's a whole lot that's not known. We don't know yet whether or not this was an internal job, meaning it could have been. This could have been one of the law clerks. It's funny. I was listening to our good friend Ross Kaminsky this morning. He was talking about law clerks for Supreme Court justices, and he qualified. He said, now don't confuse that with like a grocery clerk, right? A checkout clerk at Walmart. It's a different kind of job. For those who are not familiar with how the Supreme Court, well, actually many courts and many judges, they will have clerks. These typically are recent law school graduates the higher the level of the court, the more competitive it is. That's sort of the cream of the cream to clerk for a Supreme Court justice. Sometimes they'll clerk for a year, sometimes 2 years. I don't know if they typically go much beyond that. It's very competitive. It's the best graduates from the best law schools are competing to get those clerkships. Usually.
Best is relative.
Top ranked.
Yeah.
Top ranked.
Well, I meant top law schools.
Yeah, no, I know exactly what you mean in terms of whether it's an actual quality,
right.
Legal education, but the most prestigious and those types. And so you have these clerks who are there doing research and work for the judges. This could have been something like a clerk got a hold of this draft and decided to leak it. It could have been a lower level, could have been some other employee there. I mean, there are other staff and personnel in the Supreme Court chambers. It could have been an outside job. Somehow, maybe, I don't know if this was circulated well, it had to be circulated electronically. I mean, Politico has an electronic version of this. Did some outside person or organization, did they hack into the Supreme Court's email system or something? I mean, the point is we don't know what that means. If it is an internal job, if it's an external job, if someone outside the court somehow intercepted this, well, then that means they really need to beef up the court's security, right?
Well, that creates a lot of questions about security of our government, because in all likelihood, it is just, well, I wouldn't say in all likelihood, it is just as likely that it was a foreign government as it was a somebody in the United States.
We don't know.
Right.
We don't know. It certainly could have been. If it's an internal thing, well, first of all, I mean, the whoever did this, if this was a law clerk or an employee or so, in other words, if it was a person in a position of trust, they were entrusted to handle these documents, to keep this confidential. This was not ready to be published. This is a big thing. I mean, I would assume that person's career should be over, and I don't know in details. This will probably come out. I would assume this is illegal. I would assume there are all kinds of laws and regulations about confident. You can't work for a Supreme Court justice and take drafts of things they're writing and go, give it to media outlets. But more important, if this actually was an internal, what we call leaking is really a form of theft. It's taking something, it's taking it and doing something that you're not supposed to. Dave, if you say, man, the inside of your car is really dirty, I say, hey, I've got a vacuum cleaner. I'll clean the inside of your car, Dave. And you hand me the keys to your car. I say, great, Tom, here are the keys to my car. Please go vacuum it. And then I take the keys and I leave with your car. I drive off, right? And I go on a 2-week trip across. I've stolen your car.
Correct.
Yes, you did give me the keys, but you gave me the keys just to open the doors to get in and vacuum it.
Under certain conditions.
Yeah, not to go drive. Same thing with these documents, right? Clerks and aides and others. Yes, they do have access, but not to go run with them to media outlets.
Sure.
There's a presumption of confidentiality here. And that confidentiality is important because the court has a certain way of operating. Some of it's known, some of it remains sort of secretive. But what we do know about the Supreme Court, there's a process where cases, often from lower courts, they will appeal to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court, they sit and they look at all those cases and they decide, usually it's only a fraction, they decide to grant certiorari, meaning they're going to consider these cases. Many cases don't even get past that.
Right.
And then those cases where the court has granted cert, that's what it's called for shorthand, there's a time set aside. The justices are there, legal representation, lawyers from the parties involved in the case, and they make their arguments. And it's usually a very interactive sort of thing. The judges will ask the lawyers questions and they'll engage in some discussion and that sort of thing.
You also, just for people who don't realize, you also get briefs from other lawyers around the country. And I bring that up because we actually have lawyers within the Vino Veritas Society who are regularly submitting briefs to the Supreme Court on some of these issues.
Well, when I was in Claremont, when I was at the Claremont Institute, I worked, I worked with John Eastman, and I worked on several briefs that we as an organization submitted to cases before the Supreme Court. And those, those are called amicus briefs. It's the Latin word for friend or friendly. It means it's a friendly submission of some additional information. So as the judges are sitting there doing their research, right, someone says, hey, we think you should know this about this particular case, and submit these briefs. And then they go back to their chambers and they will talk with each other. Sometimes they'll talk together, all the judges. Sometimes 2 or 3 might, visit. They might jot down some memos. They might start writing out an argument and circulate that among some of these, say, well, what do you think about this? Would you vote in favor of this? Would you not? Many times a judge on the Supreme Court might write out an argument going all the way to some principled position, and then he learns no one's going to vote for this. No other judges are going to vote. So he might, right after conversations, he might modify that so that he can get other judges concurring and voting on his side. The point is, there's a large degree of internal trust between and among judges, traditionally even judges who disagreed with each other. I mean, Antonin Scalia and Ruth Bader Ginsburg had a kind of famous friendship. They liked each other. They talked. They would go to lunch with each other, right? And they would talk about cases. There are even cases where they were going to come out on very different sides and make very different arguments. They would respectfully share those arguments with each other,
right,
so that they understood, right, the context. All of that is now in jeopardy. All of that's in jeopardy. If there are now moles working within the Supreme Court and taking what should be private and making it public, all of a sudden, all the activities, speeches, interactions, emails, discussions become very guarded. Basically, one of the great, dangers here is that private statements within the Supreme Court, between and among justices, private statements might become as calculated as public statements made by politicians.
Right.
Because those judges, even though they're sitting there in their private chambers with the doors closed, they don't know what's going to be on the front page of, the New York Times or Politico or something like that the next day. And that would make a Supreme Court that has already, to a large extent, been politicized, thoroughly politicized. Even the discussions in closed chambers becomes political.
And while the majority opinion is often written by one justice, usually if you have a majority opinion or a minority opinion, you have a few justices. It's very rare to see 8-1, right? You don't often see one justice say, no, I disagree with the rest of the court. I'm going to stand out here by myself. What happened with this leak put Justice Alito singularly in focus, right? We don't know, were there other justices who were concurring with him? Were there, and all of a sudden what you saw immediately on the news when this broke is death threats against Justice Alito.
Right.
It was his fault. He is the guy. And while he might have written the majority opinion, people would have known, okay, this was the majority opinion, and it probably would have ended up 5-4, maybe 6-3, depending on where some things fell, but it would be very hard. And actually, I think we only have 8 justices on this particular opinion. I don't think Justice Brown Jackson is.
Yeah, I would assume she's not part of it.
I believe she's been sworn in, but I don't believe she was there when they heard the original argument.
Right. So that would make sense.
So I don't believe, and presumably, unless they're asking her opinion privately, presumably she was not, her and her clerks, her staff were not part of this whole conversation.
Right.
But you do have this now. You have to look at yourself in the same way a politician does. What are the possible consequences of me writing this? And how careful do I have to be about it getting leaked?
Yeah.
who do I share it with? And can I write what I really, I would guarantee, I think there's no one who would disagree with this. And I think if we had any of the justices sitting here with us, they would say that there are often things written in initial drafts that they decide it's a little harsh. The American people might not respond to that as well as we need them to. Let's soften this language a little bit.
Bring it down to a lower level of analysis. Just look at you and I. I mean, we communicate all day long. We're texting, we're emailing back and forth. There are things that we choose to put out to the public, official statements from us or from the Vino and Veritas Society. And we're careful about what those things, whether it's a podcast, a case study, a newsletter, we craft that message to be something we want. But very often late at night, you and I will be, dashing little text messages back and forth. And half the time they're not even complete sentences, right? Or, they're text messages back. We don't intend for any of those things to be out in public the next day. And it would be embarrassing if it was. And that's my point about, if this is now the new model, there are spies within the Supreme Court building or within that network. That really does change everything. Now, every email, every conversation will be guarded and calculated as if it was public, because it might be.
There's another problem here that adds to that. And that is, we have a system right now where that conversation might have lasted months. I mean, the conversation you're talking about, I think a lot of people think, oh, they hear the case, maybe they talk for a week, 2 weeks, and then they take time writing out their majority opinion and the minority opinion and maybe some concurring opinions or some dissenting opinions, things like that. But it's not just like a week of conversation, and then sometimes these things go on for months. And somebody, you talk about Scalia and Ginsburg sitting at lunch. Ginsburg maybe says something to Scalia, and he says, that's interesting. Give me 3 weeks. I'm going to go send one of my clerks out to go research that. I want to learn more about what you just said. Mom, maybe that would change my mind, or vice versa.
Sometimes this doesn't happen often, but it does happen. Months will go by. The justices are debating, talking. Their clerks are doing research. They have questions, outstanding questions. And so they will call for another session at the court. Yeah. They will reconvene with the lawyers involved and everything, because they have follow-up. And what that means is, they weren't sure what their opinion was. They wanted to know some more information. All this gets blown up if now there are spies and moles there.
Well, and if they continue to operate as normal, if they ignore the fact that this one got leaked and they were to continue operating the way they were intended. And I'd like to get into that in a minute about how was the court intended to operate and expand on that some more, going back to the founders. But if they were to continue that and things are getting leaked, it also presents the opportunity for lawmakers or bureaucrats, even more so, to say, well, okay, so we know the Supreme Court's going to make this decision and they're not going to hand it down for 6 months. Let's make sure we do something before then.
Right.
And I think in this case, look, there are a lot of ways we could speculate, and I could give you speculation on why this might have been somebody on a more conservative, freedom-oriented bent, to why they might have leaked this, or somebody on a more progressive end of a scale, why they would have leaked this. But one of the things that this could have greatly affected is you could have seen the Supreme Court say, this could have major impact on the midterm elections.
Right.
Let's not hand down an opinion until after. And that clerk might have said, no, we need to make sure that every American knows about this before those midterm elections. And therefore I want this out.
Yeah.
And I'm going to take that risk. And I think it is almost impossible to say that this result or this potential opinion is not going to affect how people vote in November.
Well, and let's just be real clear here. If that's true, there's a lot of likelihood. Again, we don't know for sure. One would be foolishly naive to think that's not in the realm of possibility, that someone leaked this for partisan political purposes. In that case, I mean, that really points to some kind of progressive Democrat, because that's who would benefit the most by leaking this kind of thing out. Say,
Sure.
Whoa, look what these conservative constitutionalists are going to do on the court. They actually want to uphold the Constitution and point out all the flaws with Roe v. Wade. We need to stack, right, everything. We need to stack Congress with Democrats and state legislatures and everything. They would benefit. It's hard. It's easy to see how this action of leaking might turn out lots of Democratic voters. It's not as easy to see how it would turn out lots of Republican voters.
Right. It would more point to, if it was somebody on the right, if it was somebody who was more on the Republican side, it would point to somebody getting overzealous, somebody getting so excited that this happened that maybe they were having a drink, they were talking to somebody, and they said,
I want to share this with the world.
And just got overzealous.
Yeah.
And people are human, and they're known to do things, and it's going to ruin their life. I mean, whoever that clerk was, their life their career life is over. Their legal life is over. They might have a job on MSNBC, but
their legal career is probably over. They might also write, a best-selling tell-all book about this and become a millionaire. Who knows?
Yeah, who knows? I mean, that's certainly
stranger things have happened.
That's kind of the world we live in today. Yeah. But we already saw Bernie Sanders last night and Elizabeth Warren immediately capitalizing on this.
And here I have to point this out. The almost it would be comical if the stakes weren't so great. Almost comical irony and contradiction. Progressive politicians who have mocked the Constitution, ignored the Constitution, violated and betrayed the Constitution in 1,000 ways, are now running out on public microphones saying, for those who care about a woman's right to choose, and we'll talk more about what that means and doesn't mean, those who care about a woman's right to choose and the Constitution, we have to oppose this. And it's like, really? Really? Now, number one, you care about the Constitution? Why didn't you care about the Constitution when you were passing Obamacare and Build Back Better and all these and Dodd-Frank and all these unconstitutional pieces of legislation? And the other piece is, you think standing with Roe v. Wade is a defense of the Constitution?
Right.
I mean, these are some deeply, deeply confused people.
And we should talk about whether Roe v. Wade is, why it's unconstitutional, why they're talking about overturning it. I mean, that's why this conversation is so big. It was interesting, though, you brought up Obamacare, because what if we switched positions all of a sudden? Mm-hmm. What if this was, what was Obamacare, 2010, 2012?
I'm getting old, Dave.
It's been a while.
The years are flowing by so fast.
I don't know. I tried to black out most of Obama's presidency.
I think it was 12.
12-ish, somewhere around there.
Yeah.
Let's say for the case of argument, for the case, total speculation, that this was a progressive clerk who said, I have something political to gain. Yep. I'm gonna go share this. And I'm gonna go take advantage of this.
Yes.
And all the progressives out there said, this is great that you shared it, because forget the court. The court needs to be changed. We need to pack the court. We need to codify things into law. We need to do all of these things. We need a bureaucrat to make abortion legal. Bureaucrat making it legal. It doesn't really make sense, but that's how they think. That's how they talk. They're going to make all those accusations. Now go back 10 years. And let's say this was a conservative clerk who leaked the Obamacare.
Right.
The Obamacare decision before it was out.
This is hardly any stretch. Maybe someone like a Tom Clancy could turn this into a great novel. So the Obamacare has been before the Supreme Court twice, and the Republican appointee John Roberts could not find that the Obamacare was unconstitutional 2 times.
Right.
So suppose a conservative constitutionalist clerk, maybe clerking for, I don't know, Clarence Thomas, sees a draft of this. He's like, good grief. John Roberts, the Chief Justice and a majority, they're actually going to uphold Obamacare. They're not going to strike it down the way they should. let's leak this to the press because we have some midterm elections coming up, and this will rally the Republican base when they see, look at this, the court is failing to do its job and they're going to uphold Obamacare. How would progressives have responded to that?
Forget the midterms. This would have been the 2012
that's right.
election.
Right.
This could have literally taken Obama out of office. If that had been leaked before and said, look, you have got to put, you've got to get Republicans to dominate if you think this is wrong. I mean, that is the equivalent. And it just goes to show how politicized this whole thing can turn out. This is not just one party. This is not just the other. If this is the new norm for the Supreme Court no longer functions as anything but a political tool for those who are running our government.
We've also become, to a large extent, as America has become increasingly progressive, it's become increasingly Machiavellian. And what I mean by that is so many of our fellow citizens today believe that the end or the goal justifies any means at all, whatever is necessary. So, one of the questions we should be asking right now, is it wrong for a clerk to steal and leak a draft of an opinion? Or is it only wrong when a conservative clerk, for a conservative justice, right, steals a draft and leaks it to the, is it okay? Is it allowable, or at least worth, turning the, you're averting your eyes in the other direction if it's a progressive who did this for some progressive cause?
Well, the question becomes, is there a truth contained in this? Is it true that stealing and leaking is wrong? Or is there no such thing as truth, and therefore it depends on who you're asking? Is it right?
Going back to Orwell. Does the Ministry of Truth declare today that leaking and stealing and leaking a draft opinion is allowable? It's okay. But on some other day, if it's not in the interest of the Ministry of Truth, maybe they'll declare it to be wrong.
It's just shocking. So before we take this any further, and I want to get into all of the implications of where this might lead our country, let's take first a quick step back, and I'm hoping you can do it relatively quickly, but I know this is really important, and I want to make sure our members have a clear understanding. Let's talk a little bit about the Federalist Papers at the beginning. Let's talk a little bit about the creation of the court, the Constitution, and what was the purpose of the court? Why were things created the way they were, and why was this designed the way it was? And maybe if you would, take that sort of story all the way through FDR, and FDR talking about packing the court, because that's going to become the next conversation as part of this, is you're going to start getting a lot of people on the left saying this decision is outrageous. The solution is to pack the court.
Right. Boy, Dave, you gave me a tough challenge there to make this short. You really, to understand the role of the court in the United States within our constitutional system, you really need to think about what it means to have a constitutional government, and in particular, to have a constitution that is higher than and more authoritative than statutory law. Here in the United States, there is a difference. There is the Constitution, which doesn't change unless we, the people, amend it. And then it is supposed to rule over all the branches of government and everything government does, including the laws that government passes. For example, in most parliamentary systems of government, England is a great example, but in really any kind of parliamentary system, there is no difference between constitutional law and statutory law. Every act of the parliament is supremely authoritative. There is no higher law to compare it to. England doesn't have a written constitution that when Parliament passes a law, there's nothing to compare it to or judge it by. We have a written constitution. We have a constitutional government. And on the one hand, we're the source of political authority. The source of political sovereignty is we, the people. We, the people, however, have authorized different things. On the one hand, we've authorized the Constitution. Famously begins, we, the people, in order to form a more perfect union, right? We do ordain and establish this Constitution. We, the people, also elect representatives and senators, and we elect presidents, and those members of Congress and the executive, they pass laws. So in a way, those laws are authorized indirectly by we the people as well. And so the very nature of our constitutional system sets up a potential conflict between the Constitution and statutory laws that our elected representatives pass. They might conflict. Members of Congress, I know this is hard to believe, they might pass laws they're not constitutionally authorized to pass.
Right.
What should be done in that situation? That really is the beginning of the idea of an independent judicial branch, a branch that can set back. It wasn't involved in adopting the Constitution. It wasn't involved in passing the law. It will render judgments about the law. And the authors of the Federalist Papers, Madison and Hamilton, they come out in defense of something called judicial review.
Right.
In a way, it's the most, one could argue it's the most striking, arguably the most important thing that the judicial branch does. It also tends to be the most unusual, the rarest, because most cases before a court involve allegations of people violating the laws. Think of like a typical criminal case, right? Someone's accused of theft or assault or murder or whatever. And then the question is, well, is there evidence? Did that person actually break the law? But occasionally there are questions about the law itself. Maybe the law involved in a case conflicts with the Constitution. Maybe the law shouldn't be there. Who's going to make that decision? That is one of the high purposes of the Supreme Court, according to the authors of the Federalist Papers. They arrive at this in a very peculiar way. Hamilton writes, this is in Federalist number 78. He sets it up with an example that does happen often in courts. There might be two laws involved in a case that conflict with each other. This is just a really simple example for people to follow. Imagine a car crash on a street.
Yeah.
Two cars hit head on.
Yeah.
And the one driver says, well, look, I was driving on the right side of the road the way the law says I should. So you, the other guy, you were driving on the left side of the road, right? It's your fault. And the other guy goes and finds a law from a long time, 100 years ago, that says drive on the left side of the road. So here you have two conflict. One law says drive on the right, and the other law says drive on the left. They are incompatible with each other. What should happen? The Federalist Paper says in those cases, the judge should give force to the most recent law because it is the most recent expression of what the people want, what the citizens want. So the law drive on the right hand, if that's the newer law, the law should uphold that. The guy driving on the left-hand side would be wrong in the case of that crash.
Presuming one doesn't violate the Constitution. The newer one doesn't violate the Constitution.
And that leads into the very next section of that argument in Federal 78 is, well, what happens when a law, statutory law, violates the Constitution? By definition, a statutory law is going to be newer than the Constitution because the Constitution creates Congress and all the legislative bodies, right? So what happens when a new law violates the very old Constitution? The Federalist Paper says, well, in those cases, the rule should be reversed.
Right.
The judge should go with the older, in this case, the Constitution, because it's superior, it's supreme. Now, I don't want to get too much in the weeds here. I've never actually found that argument entirely persuasive in Federal 78. But when you add that argument with the rest of the book, the rest of the collection of essays, the Federalist makes clear that the Constitution is a wise Constitution. It is wisely designed. It is fundamentally good because it's in the service of human liberty and protecting individual rights. Then it makes sense to uphold the Constitution, because if the Constitution is wisely designed, it's not perfect.
Right.
It's a man-made law, but it's fundamentally good. Its purposes are noble and right, protecting the individual rights of citizens. Then a law that contradicts it, by definition, would be less moral, less wise, right? Or more foolish if it's violating this wise and good Constitution.
And from that perspective, you can take this back to the beginning of our conversation about this governance, disinformation governance board.
Right.
The Constitution, part of judicial review is did the Constitution grant the power to the government to create this new rule, law,
whatever it is, whatever it did.
Yep. If not, then it is not legal. It's not constitutional, and the Constitution has that higher ground. We did not give the government. We never at any point granted the government to decide what is disinformation and what is truth. Therefore, it's unconstitutional.
The Ministry of Truth is clearly unconstitutional. Right. Now here's the rub. Here's where it gets a little messy. The Federalist Papers, and really just several years after, in a very important Supreme Court case, Marbury versus Madison, this is the first exercise of judicial review. Chief Justice John Marshall strikes down part of the Judiciary Act. But more importantly, that view from the founders, and here I would include John Marshall in that as well, was the Constitution has this objective meaning. We can all read it. We can see what powers we, the people, have delegated to those in government, to those in Congress. And then the judge or the judges on the Supreme Court, they sit and they compare an act by Congress, right, with the objective meaning of the Constitution. And if those people in Congress exercise some power that the Constitution never granted to them, the court has an obligation to stand up and offer their opinion and say, this was an unconstitutional act of power. That view of judicial review that came out of the founding is strikingly different than the modern progressive view, which is judges, the Constitution means whatever judges on the Supreme Court says that it means. Sure. That was not part of there was no argument in the Federalist Papers or in John Marshall's corpus of jurisprudence that the meaning of the Constitution is going to change with the personnel on the Supreme Court. That was never part of the idea. Was the whole idea of having John Marshall goes, by the way, if you've never read Marshall's opinion, Marbury versus Madison, I recommend it. It's easily accessible and it's not very long.
We should get into it at some point because there was a lot of really interesting results out of that set some really important precedents for the court forever.
Well, and he emphasizes at great length in there what it means to have a written Constitution. I mean, he goes on and on examining this idea of a written Constitution that all eyes can see it. Everyone can read it. It has an objective, coherent meaning. Right. It's not a malleable piece of plastic for later generations of justices on the Supreme Court to mess with. That idea of the court and judicial review, well, in fact, for 150 years, the court exercises judicial review precisely twice, only two times. Marbury versus Madison, which is in 1803, and Chief Justice Roger Taney's disastrous decision in Dred Scott in 1857. Other than that, the court's not getting that involved in striking down because Congress isn't doing that much. There's not that much legislation, right?
Yeah.
All that changes, as our listeners probably think and can anticipate, in the 1930s. Along comes Franklin Roosevelt, his New Deal. These New Dealing Democrats in Congress start creating all kinds of hosts of federal agencies and programs, and the court starts striking them down. One after saying that this isn't, you and Congress don't have the power to pass a law regulating how much businesses can charge for their products and pay employees, and that's all in the private realm.
Right.
And after the 1936 election, Roosevelt is reelected. Democrats win huge majorities in both chambers of Congress. And Roosevelt says, you know what, we're done. We're done with these constitutionalist clowns on the Supreme Court striking down our New Deal stuff. And he poses a plan. The plan is the Constitution says there has to be a Supreme Court. It does not define the size. It grants that power to Congress. Congress gets to decide how many judges, and it has varied there's been times when the court had 6 members, had 9 members. He says, hey, why don't we just increase the size of the court to 15 or 20 or 25? And all those new seats will fill them with New Dealing Democrats, who will rubber stamp all of our New Deal stuff. Now, the plan backfires. It doesn't actually happen, but it is this huge pivotal moment in politicizing the court. The court is no longer really seen as this independent body. It is seen as greatly affected by the politics of the day.
Well, and what we saw throughout that process was the court did start to change. The way the court would rule started to change after that threat. So and there were some other things that FDR was doing that was causing judges to start voting in other ways. He was also able to replace a few justices during his 13 years in office.
There were a couple of important cases right during this period when Roosevelt is he's trying to hatch this plan and get Congress to go along with him. And it's like judges on the Supreme Court, see the light. All of a sudden, these New Deal programs become constitutional, and they start approving them. And Supreme Court historians call this the switch in time that saved nine justice, rather than the number going up to 15 or 20, because they started approving all these New Deal programs, and now there was no longer a need to add, a bunch of seats to the Supreme Court.
And one of the best examples that we've referenced several times over the last 101 episodes is Wickard v. Filburn.
Yes, absolutely. Very much that was right there in that period when that's happening. All of a sudden, they're finding ridiculous excuses to justify these blatantly unconstitutional exercises of power.
So we are going to get some suggestion of that again. But you also mentioned something else as you were going through there that I think is really important. And I'd like to talk a little bit now about the decision itself that is potentially coming down. We still don't know if this leaked document from Justice Alito is going to be the actual decision. Is it a concurring opinion, right? He could be writing a concurrent opinion that is not the majority opinion.
Yeah.
But that could be the result, and we could have all different kinds of things. But you did talk about Dred Scott.
Yeah.
Right. And as the second instance of judicial review.
Yes.
And what we saw was 4 years following Dred Scott. Am I correct on my dates?
Dred Scott was in 1857, March of 1857, and by April of 1861, we're at war.
We're at war.
It's the Civil War. And if that doesn't give you goosebumps, it should.
Right.
It should send chills up your spine, because culturally, we are in a very similar position. Very similar. Those years leading up to Lincoln was elected in November of 1860. He is sworn in March 4th of 1861. And 6 weeks later, mid-April, is the bombing of Fort Sumter, and we're at war. And when you look at those years preceding his election and the beginning of the war, Americans stopped talking to each other. They would not, over political differences. Family members would not be in the same room with each other over political differences revolving around slavery. There were great efforts to silence people, organizations. States like Alabama, Mississippi passed state laws that would prohibit the distribution of any abolitionist literature. It became a crime. If you wrote up a little anti-slavery pamphlet and mailed it, you could be arrested. If you stood in the town square, if you stood in the park and said, I'm going to speak for the next 30 minutes on why slavery is a bad institution, you could be arrested.
Sounds like the work of a government disinformation governance board.
Exactly, right? People stopped believing each other. Both sides decided that the solution was to scream louder and denounce the others with increasing, vitriol and invective and just hurling terrible, insults at each other. Culturally, we're in a very similar place. Right. And then along comes, the Dred Scott decision. And the Dred Scott decision said that slavery is constitutionally protected, that a slave owner has a constitutional right to his property in slaves. And here's what's really frightening. At the very core, I write about this in my book on Lincoln. I have a copy here on the table. The very core of Dred Scott is identical to the core of Roe versus Wade. Mm-hmm. The Constitution has provisions that protect persons. The Fifth Amendment, this is the big one in the Dred Scott case. The Fifth Amendment says no person And notice it doesn't even refer to citizen.
Yeah.
It's persons. No person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. That means even if a visitor, a traveler from another country is here, a foreigner, not a citizen, that still doesn't, I can't go deprive that person of his life, his liberty. I can't go steal from him, right, without due process of law. Several important Supreme Court cases, here we get the court involved again. They said that Fifth Amendment protection applies only to the federal government, not to states.
Right.
That's what the court said. Now, the Fifth Amendment doesn't actually say that. The Fifth Amendment just says no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. It doesn't say, and that applies only to the federal government, right? It doesn't say anything about feds versus states. But precisely because of that problem, after the Civil War, Americans passed the 14th Amendment, and they say, okay, if the Fifth Amendment applies only to the federal government, then the 14th Amendment is going to address states directly, and it does. Mm-hmm. It says no state shall deprive a person of life, liberty, or property without due process. So it repeats that language of depriving someone of life, liberty, or property. It also says a state must offer equal protection of the laws to all persons.
Right.
So you see the theme here. The theme is the idea of person. All these protections are for persons. The great question in Dred Scott was, well, is a slave of African descent, this black man, Dred, that was his name, Dred Scott.
Right.
Is Dred Scott a person? And the Supreme Court, under the leadership of Democrat Roger Taney, consulted science. They looked at science textbooks. And they say, well, many scientists say that on the evolutionary, the scale of human evolution, African Negroes are really not persons. And there are people in American history who said they weren't, so they're not included. That provision protecting persons doesn't apply to slaves of African ancestry. Well, I take that back. He said it doesn't apply to anyone of African ancestry. So not only Dred Scott was a slave, legally held as a slave, a free black man in Boston, Massachusetts, who owns a house, who owns a business, who votes, right? All those things. The Dred Scott case said that's not a person. These protections don't apply to him because they're excluded from personhood. In the case of Roe v. Wade in 1973, the case turns on the 14th Amendment's protections for persons. Mm-hmm. No state shall deprive a person of life, liberty, or so is the act of abortion, is that procedure, is that depriving that unborn human being of its life and also its liberty by definition, And there again, they consult science textbooks. Well, many medical texts say this is an embryo. This is a fetus. This is a morula of cells. It's not a person. One of the things that you learn looking through these two cases, Dred Scott and Roe v. Wade, and they really do share a lot. They share a lot. Is that even the greatest Constitution of liberty. So suppose there was a better Constitution than ours. The most perfect Constitution of liberty could be transformed into an instrument of tyranny and injustice simply by defining certain groups of human beings as not human. Just say, well, all these protections for liberty don't apply to that group because we're defining them as not human. It's also interesting, those who rally behind these cases are the people who want to harm and control others.
Right.
Who rallied behind Dred Scott? People who wanted to enslave others. Who rallies behind Roe versus Wade? People who want to destroy little, tiny lives.
Right.
That's what they have in common. And in both cases, people, well, certainly the case in Dred Scott and it appears in Roe versus Wade, people are willing to go to great lengths and fight, and they're dead serious. Fight to preserve that freedom to control others.
You just took a fairly strong position on this, right? I mean, this is a controversial discussion, and you took a fairly strong position that those fetuses, those cells, those embryos, those are lives.
Yeah.
And therefore the Constitution requires the protection of those lives. It is a very slippery slope. And this is where I personally come out on this, is if you want to not define that as a life, and you do that by saying, well, those cells, that embryo, that fetus can't take care of itself, so therefore it's not a life. It relies on the mother.
The term people use is viability.
Right.
They're not viable, meaning they are physiologically dependent on the mother prior to a certain period of time.
And I think the more important word you just use is dependent.
Right.
Right. What scares me in this whole conversation is the idea of dependency. Right. If you're going to say that if dependency determines viability, a 3-day-old child is still dependent on
very much
on being taken care of. A 3-week-old, a 3-month-old,
they'll die.
10-year-old in many circumstances.
Yes. I mean, just to be clear, a newborn baby will die if left alone.
Right.
If just left alone. If no one feeds it, cares for it, it will die. It can't take care of itself. And so it is utterly dependent. And the question is, does dependency mean absence of rights? Does a dependent human being not have the same natural rights as everyone else? And here it's a very short step to get from the argument for abortion to the argument for infanticide, taking newborn babies, and if they're, somehow defective, born with certain problems, or maybe just not wanted, to euthanasia, because it turns out dependency is not only a condition of newborn human beings, it's also a condition of very old and sick human beings. And what happens when someone becomes very old or very sick and becomes dependent on other? And I mean, this is cutting edge political and social theory in our universities, are those advancing arguments for euthanasia. Well, at some point, these old people become, a financial drag on society, rather than putting resources into putting grandma in the nursing home. Those could be welfare payments, right, going to younger people.
Right.
So let's just kill the old people off.
Or Social Security is bankrupt. We can't afford these old people anymore. So let's just get rid of them. Right. It's a terrifying thought process and analogy. And so for that reason, you do make the argument, you can make the comparison from Dred Scott to Roe v. Wade and how this whole thing plays out. And it's interesting. You talk about euthanasia. It's euthanasia now. It was, in that context, the science of the day was eugenics, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And it was eugenics was the science talking about slavery.
We should also connect those things, because euthanasia, which is a form of eugenics,
right?
Euthanasia is the killing of the elderly or the disabled, the dependent, anyone who's dependent, which is a branch of eugenics, which is the scientific management of the human gene pool.
Right.
And all of that, eugenics itself, comes out of progressivism. It's part of this idea of the scientific planning and engineering of a society. One of the great, innovators in the realm of eugenics was a woman, a scientist named Margaret Sanger, who is responsible for Planned Parenthood. And she was very open about these things. She thought Black people were insufficiently intelligent and insufficiently virtuous.
Right.
That they couldn't control themselves, they couldn't control their appetites and their temptations, and they were pretty stupid, and they really weren't fit for civil society. And that's why she wanted lots of abortion clinics in predominantly Black neighborhoods, to slow down their population growth.
Right. So one last piece of all of this, and that is, I want to gameplay this out a little bit. Where does this go? Because we saw what happened with Dred Scott, and truthfully, it's a little terrifying of where does this decision and the response of this decision go. So we saw the draft from Justice Alito We don't know if that's going to be the final version of the majority opinion, if that was a concurring opinion, if it's something else. We don't know if things are going to change between now and when it's released.
Right.
And let's also, note here, it's at least worth saying, by the time this podcast comes out, there might have been a lot more known, and we admit that, we recognize that. But there is a gameplay to play out of what happens here.
Yeah,
let's start talking first about what happened with Dred Scott.
Yeah, so right, the country was increasingly divided. Abolitionism had become more radical. Those who wanted to protect the institution of slavery, and to be clear, they talked about their freedom. As ironic as that sounds, they talked about they wanted to be free,
right,
to have the kind of institutions they wanted, including slavery. They wanted the freedom to enslave others. They really dug in their heels and started making arguments that they were the defenders of civilization. They were the defenders of tradition. And in a way they were defending a very old traditional institution. And Southerners looked at that Dred Scott case and said, according to the logic of it, Taney's argument, Taney didn't actually make this argument, but they concluded, they deduced from it, if a slave owner has a constitutional right in his slave property and he's free to take his slaves out into the territories, that's what the fight was all about.
Mm-hmm.
Well, doesn't he also have a constitutional right to take his slave property to Boston, to New York? In other words, isn't every free state, every state that has prohibited slavery, like Massachusetts and New York and Pennsylvania and Lincoln's home, Illinois, all those states had passed state laws prohibiting slavery. Southerners started saying, you can get rid of those. Slavery must be legalized, permitted all across the country, because the Supreme Court just said, we have a constitutional right, and no state can violate our constitutional right to our slave property. And I should add to this, those who believed in slavery similar to those who believe in abortion today, those who believed in slavery in the 1850s were not satisfied with other people saying, okay,
right,
if you want slavery, that's fine for you. No. They wanted positive affirmation that slavery is positively good. And anyone they didn't just want to be left alone. South Carolina didn't want to just be left alone to have slavery. They wanted people in the North saying slavery is positively good. It's great. It should be encouraged and spread everywhere. You see a similar movement among certain advocates for abortion, that they don't want to just be able to have an abortion themselves. They want others standing up and saying, this is a great, wonderful, good thing.
Right. Well, and you see that with almost every progressive policy. It diminishes their belief in the quality of the science. It diminishes the value of the science in their mind if some people can have laws that contradict their science, right?
Yes.
So if they say the science, their determined truth.
And also the morality of their position, right? If their position really is the moral position, whether it's subsidized housing or subsidized public education, whatever it is, if their position is the moral position, then dissent can't be allowed. That means those other people are immoral. Those other people who are not progressive are morally wrong.
Right. Which is why Hillary Clinton stands up and calls them deplorables.
Yes.
Yes. So let's take all of that into context, and let's play out what the next few years could look like.
Well, let's make clear here. If the court, and this is a big if, we do not know yet how things are shaking out in the court. If they come out opposed to Roe versus Wade, there are at least two ways that could go.
Right.
One way it could go, the court could say Roe versus Wade was wrongly decided for the following reasons, and things revert to what they were prior to Roe. And that is, it's up to each state. Just like something like, I don't know, driver's licenses and marriage laws, like how old do people have to be married? That's up to the state. Different states have different age limits. Abortion was like that prior to Roe. It was up to each state if they wanted to pass laws about this, regulate this, up to each state.
Concealed carry laws are another great example of that.
Yes, concealed carry, laws. Also prior to the war on drugs, regulating drugs and things like that. That was up to each state.
Sure.
Gambling, another example. Another direction the court could go. Now, this would be a more radical shift. We were just talking a little bit about the 14th Amendment of the Constitution says states must offer equal protection. And no one, not the court could say, not even an unborn person can be deprived of their life, liberty, or property without due process of law. And the abortion procedure, that's taking someone's life and liberty without due process of law.
Right.
So it could be this complete reversal from the position of Roe, which was abortion must be permitted in all states, to the complete opposite. Abortion is prohibited in all states under the 14th Amendment. That is an argument the court can make. We don't know. I don't believe that's in this draft that was leaked. I'm just saying that is in the realm of possibility. In the same way, just to make a comparison here, in the same way that after the Civil War, Americans adopted the 13th Amendment, and that did not say it's up to each state.
Right.
It said slavery is prohibited anywhere in the United States, right? In that sense, a constitutional mandate like that, an amendment, trumps federalism. It's more important. And the 14th Amendment trumps federalism.
So let's take the latter first, and then we'll go back to the former. Let's go to the latter idea that they take it all the way to the other direction of Roe. You're going to have massive upheaval when it comes to current elections, and you are going to see all kinds of things start to happen that could potentially lead to some very dangerous activities between neighbors, right? If we continue down this path, you're going to see this. This is one of those issues that can really just strike that line of okay, we're not talking anymore. This is it.
Let's also be clear. Similar to the war on drugs, you can criminalize drugs and drug use. That doesn't mean you stop it. It means you drive it underground, right? Into black markets. So should the court declare all abortions as violations of the 14th Amendment, that doesn't mean there won't be abortions. It means there won't be legalized abortions. Right. There won't be abortions, operating in the light of day within the scope of the law. It'll be done, but probably with less frequency because they'll happen outside the scope of the law.
Right. The other situation is a little more interesting to play out. The opportunity of this becoming a federalist type model where states get different decisions.
Yeah.
We have been seeing for the last few years, as you saw leading up to Dred Scott, we've seen this parting of ways of conservatives moving to red states and progressives either staying in blue states, going to certain states where they see an opportunity to shift the political landscape. We've seen that in Colorado, especially over the last.
It is a curious thing. I suspect more Democrats have been going to red states than Republicans going to blue states.
Oh, without a doubt.
Right. I mean, Democrats are leaving places like I was out in California for over a decade, right? Democrats are, they're tired. They're tired of the regulation. They're tired of the taxes. I mean, I was there when Toyota USA, the U.S. headquarters of Toyota, picked up their headquarters and moved to Texas, a very red state, because it's easier to operate a business. And so you do see more Democrats going to red states than you see Republicans, I think, heading to blue states.
Just like you saw with Elon Musk moving Tesla to Texas.
Yes.
But you're right. We see a lot of Democrats, of progressives, moving from blue states to red states, although they're careful about who the governor is, right? You don't see a lot of Democrats, you don't see a lot of progressives moving to Florida today.
Yeah, that's
They're
true.
not going to go live under Ron DeSantis and follow that.
And there is this curious thing. This was probably worth a whole podcast in itself, Dave. The psychology of a progressive Democrat who's fed up with New York or California, and they want to get out, they want to leave, and they move to a place like Texas, or a decade or more ago, they used to come to a place like Colorado. And then what do? They keep voting for the same kinds of people and the same kind of policies they had back in their home state that they left.
Because they don't see it as a policy issue. They see it as a people issue. It's that minority of Republicans. It's that minority of conservatives who are causing all of their problems because that's what they're being told. Gavin Newsom isn't out there saying my policies are causing all these bad things. Nancy Pelosi, of all people, is not saying it's the policies that I'm encouraging in San Francisco that are causing crime and homelessness and drug use and all of these problems you're seeing in San Francisco. No, it's that the Republicans are in our way of really getting full government control over all of these things.
Well, that's the elite political class. But how about ordinary Democrats who leave California because they say, we're tired.
Right.
Housing prices are so expensive and all these things are terrible. I'm leaving California. Do they blame their problems on Republicans?
Yes. I'm saying that's what they're being told.
Yeah.
Nancy Pelosi is telling them, you just need to go somewhere where a government can fully control your life. We are insufficiently progressive in San Francisco would be her response. We are trying to be as much based on science and have the government take care of you as possible. But those Republicans, they're causing problems for you, and you need to get rid of them.
So this has always been curious to me. A Democrat who flees San Francisco or Los Angeles and goes to Houston, Texas, what is it they think they're going to? In their mind, what is it that Texas offers that is good and appealing? And why do they think they're leaving California?
That's a good question. I don't know. My guess is usually that's a job situation.
Yeah.
You do see these successful companies that exist in these red states, in these freedom-based states. You see companies that are thriving, that are hiring a lot of people. It's a great job opportunity. I'm going to go to Texas and I'm going to go for this job, but I'm going to keep fighting for the high moral ground that I know that they believe I've
spent a lot of time the last 3 years in Connecticut. Connecticut used to have all these, and they still have some, but they used to have far more very successful, big businesses and companies. At one time, I believe Connecticut used to have more gun manufacturers than any state in the country. All these businesses are fleeing, and people are just leaving because the progressive between the taxation and the regulation, it's just become unbearable.
Well, what you're going to see is what I think if this does become a state-based issue, which is what it sounds like Alito's opinion is, if it does go in that direction, I think this becomes the one issue that gets people moving specifically for an issue in and of itself. You are going to see people moving to I already saw here in Colorado, Governor Polis put out a statement saying, we think this is wrong.
Yep.
What the Supreme Court what it sounds like the Supreme Court is ruling is wrong. But we just passed a law here in Colorado, and we will stick by it, and we will continue to defend women and
basically
this and that.
Abortion without any restrictions at all.
Right.
So if what you're saying is true, then it's interesting. If liberal Democrats start to migrate to bastions of liberalism and conservative, there aren't very many. And so what might very quickly happen then, you have Democrats fleeing to California, New York, Illinois, Colorado, a few other places. That also means the number of blue states shrinks and the number of red states grows.
And remember, we just had a census done.
Yeah.
So electoral college votes won't change in the next 10 years.
Right.
You will see an event, I believe, that there will be major political implications from this, and those political implications will lead to anger. Those political implications will lead to fighting. Those political implications right now, envisioning a civil war is very, very difficult because it is, you think back to the 1860s, you had an entire part of the country, right? Entire states and entire parts of the country that wanted one thing, and you had entire parts of the country that wanted another. And they went to war, right? It was the North versus the South.
Yeah, it was very geographic.
Right.
In the Civil War, there was this geographical curiosity which sort of amplified the conflict. There was a clear line. There was the Mason-Dixon. There was a clear line dividing the free states from the slave states. Modern America, even with this kind of migration that you're talking about, it's much more of a patchwork quilt.
Right.
Right. So you've got California, you have New York, and a few New England, Massachusetts, a few small New England states, New Jersey, you have Illinois, you have a few bastions of Democratic power. But what this would mean under our Constitution, if the number of Republican states, if all those progressives say, oh, I need to be in Illinois or I need to be in New York so that I can live my progressive lifestyle, and the number of Republican states comes to largely outnumber the number of Democratic states, it means a future of Republican presidents. It means a future of Republican-controlled Congresses. It means a future of many more Republican justices on the Supreme Court.
Which, if the last few summers have shown us anything, the riots and the violence and the crime and everything else have shown us anything, there are large groups of people in this country who will not stand for that, who will get violent over this. And if that were to happen, I do think we're a bit of a tinderbox right now. Yeah. We have been leading up to this Dred Scott moment. And you do have right now, like, yes, Colorado or Illinois, you talk about those states. If you go outside of Chicago to other parts of Illinois, they are not bastions of progressivism.
Yep. Well, we see it here in Colorado, right? We're sitting here in Denver.
Right.
And Denver is very, very different politically and culturally from the entire rest of the state.
Right. But there's a majority of people in Denver, so they tend to make a lot of the law. And right now that makes it difficult to envision what a civil conflict would look like.
The other you pointed this out earlier when you and I were talking offline. In 1857, when the court handed down its Dred Scott opinion, everything was much slower than today. News traveled slow, right? I mean, literally life was just slower. Today, everything is instant. Everything is electronic and instant. And so that's something else, right? We got to, after the Dred Scott decision, it took 4 years for that simmer to become a boil and boil over into open violent conflict. 4 years then, what, if we're in a similar situation today, what does that look like?
And it's easier to move around. Moving in 1857 was a lot harder than moving in 2022.
Or even just traveling.
Right. And I look at things, we also have a lot more time of study to look back and understand human behavior in America under our Constitution, under progressivism. And I look at this and it would be foolish. We're going to see this week on our website, people are going to see in the commentary section an article you wrote on crime.
Yeah.
And we talked last week, I briefly mentioned I was burgled and for the third time in 8 months in the Denver metro area.
Yeah.
We are now getting to a point where you have to seriously think about, even if the violence hasn't started yet, it is worth at least thinking through, do I want to stay in this area, knowing what potentially might happen? And I think you are going to see that continuing migration. You're going to see these states become very red or very blue. You're going to start to see places that have a strong protection of private property. They really emphasize police protecting individual rights and private property and the rule of law. And you're going to see places like the Seattle zone
defunding the police.
Right.
Yeah.
And these zones like in Seattle where police aren't even allowed.
Yeah.
And as that happens, we are going to start to see the makings of what could turn into a much more significant and dangerous civil conflict.
Well, Dave, there's a lot more to talk about. We're way over our time, but I want to assure our members of the Vino and Veritas Society right now, more than any time in living memory, right now, it's really important that we have people who can guard the American idea, guard the principles of liberty, because they are in a very fragile state, and it makes our work, our effort, everything that we do more important than ever.
Well, and guard and trust, right? And understand truth, all of our precepts, but that trust, that mutual civic trust, we need to keep finding those people. And I hope people are really taking that part of the Vino and Veritas Society seriously.
Yeah.
Because right now, when things start to get potentially dangerous, right now is the time. You need to know who you can lean on and who you can trust and who you can stand next to.
I'm going to be very clear. One of the most important things our members can do right now is go find 5 friends and ask them to join the Vino and Veritas Society. Bring them into the network, bring them into this group.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. And we will continue this conversation. We will continue to see. And obviously this is an evolving conversation that we'll know more next week as we get into things. Until then, no somos custodios.